Welcome everyone. I'm Andrea Silverman. I'm an assistant professor of environmental engineering at the Tandon School of Engineering at NYU. I also have appointments at CUSP and the School of Global Public Health. This is session 1B, Environment and Sustainability, and I'm the moderator today. We have 6 speakers up today, though one of them may or may not be able to join us depending on a conflict, but we'll try to fit him in if he's able to come. So the speakers are myself, Charlie Mydlarz, Elizabeth Henaff, Kevin Cromar, Rae Zimmerman, and Tae Hong Park, and those names are in the chat. Just to give you a sense of how this session is going to be run, just for housekeeping, it'd be great if everyone can keep themselves muted until the question and answer session, unless you're talking. We will have a question and answer session, so definitely jot down questions that you have as they come up. The way that we're running this session is that there's first going to be lightning talks, the 3-minute talks by the 6 of us that are on board, which will take about 15 minutes. After that, we're going to have a panel discussion for around 15. After that, a question and answer session. So, all the questions from everyone else is here. And then there's going to be breakout rooms. And so each of the panelists will be in a separate room, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, Katrina. And that people can join to have individual discussions with people within that room. During that time, we also have a poster from Daniel, who's here. And so if you want to stay in the main room, you can talk to Daniel and hear more about his work. With that, I guess we should probably get started unless there's any questions or thoughts before we jump in. Great. And Katrina, should we go in the order that's here? I guess so.
Yeah.
Cool. I guess I'm going first. So since I'm already unmuted, share my screen. Hopefully you can all see this. Cool. So as mentioned, I'm Andrea. I work in water quality, water treatment, and wastewater treatment. And what I'm presenting on today is the work that I've been doing in partnership with the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, which is our water and wastewater utility, doing COVID-19 monitoring through sewage surveillance. So actually collecting wastewater samples from the treatment facilities in New York City and looking for concentrations of SARS-CoV-2. I want to note that this work is being mostly done by my postdoc, Catherine Hoare, who's been working directly with the DEP. The motivation for this work is that, first of all, we're in a global pandemic, which I'm sure I don't have to remind anyone of. And also the finding early on during the pandemic that SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, replicates in the gastrointestinal tract and is therefore excreted in feces. And because of that, there's very high concentrations of this virus in the human waste of people who are infected. And we can therefore use quantitative PCR methods to actually quantify the RNA signal within the virus. This is an exciting opportunity because given some of the lapses in our ability to measure this virus through clinical samples, whether there was a lack of testing or there's an unwillingness to get tested in some communities, we're able to actually sample a whole community through the wastewater that they're producing. So in New York City in particular, we have 14 wastewater treatment facilities. They're on the map shown here, and each of those treatment facilities serves what we call a sewer shed. So what you see in these bounding lines. So within this spatial area, every single person that goes to the bathroom their human waste is combined and goes to the treatment plant, and we're able to take that sample and in effect sample the whole community. Because of this and the promise of being able to do, have another set of surveillance data for COVID-19, we were contacted by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection in April, and we were asked to help them set up a permanent sewage monitoring system for SARS-CoV-2, but also there's plenty of other organisms that are in human waste. And so the goal is that when this crisis is over, to be able to also look for other organisms of health concern. This is an exciting project because we're actually doing this in partnership. It's true translational research in that we did method optimization. There's definitely a lot of work in the research phase, yet all of this work was done in the city's laboratory. And most of the data collection is actually being done by city employees at this point, which is great because that means that any data that's collected is already in their hands and we don't have to do any transfer. Just to give you a sense of what this data looks like, we spent the summer getting the methods in place, procuring what we needed to do, writing SOPs, and we were really in business in September. This is data from our 14 treatment plants across New York City. The red line is the 7-day average new COVID cases, and it's on the secondary y-axis on a log scale. The dots that you see are each of our individual data point with a best fit lowest curve through them, and they're the SARS-CoV-2 or the virus concentrations measured in wastewater, and it's on the primary y-axis also with a log scale. And what you can see is we see a pretty clear trend that the trends between viruses and health or cases are very similar. We're in the process of actually quantifying this, so trying to look at correlations, trying to figure out what the best fit is between different metrics of describing each of these data sets, so that we can eventually have a model where if you have if you measure a virus concentration, you can have some sort of prediction of the new cases in the community that's being served by that treatment plant. As I mentioned, even though, we like to say that we're kind of building the boat as we're sailing, definitely still in the research phase, even though we are collecting data and sending it to the Department of Health. Some burning questions, there's a lot of questions, but a couple burning questions are one, about method optimization and standardization, because different groups and different utilities and different health departments across the US are using different methods, because we just had to get things running as fast as we could. So it's a lot of work we need to do to unpack what those methods are and what they're actually telling us. A huge question also is, how did health departments use this data? Do they like this data? Do they find it useful? Can they actually use it for designing interventions? And I'd be happy to talk about that in the breakout sessions, because there's a lot of discussions we've had with departments of health across the country to better understand what some of the limitations are. And then another big question that has come up is whether we can do RNA sequencing to identify point mutations on the genome of the virus. So given that we are collecting a community sample of this virus, can we sequence and then look for mutations to get a sense of what variants are circulating in the community, since it's a huge public health question. And this is something that Elizabeth Henaff, who's on the call, is also involved in. There's a lot of people to thank. I'm not going to thank them out of the interest of time. But yeah, thank you very much. Cool. And then next up, it looks like is Charlie Mydlarz. Thanks, Charlie. Katrina, do you have Charlie's presentation? Do you want to put that up?
Yes, I do. I can share my screen.
Sweet.
Thank you. So I'm Charlie Mydlarz, a research assistant professor at the Center for Urban Science and Progress over in Brooklyn. And I'm excited to talk to you today about the Flood Sense project, which we're working on. This is a project led by Elizabeth Henaff on the call, Andrea, Tiga Brain, and my role on the project is more on the sensor work, and that's mainly what I'm going to focus on today. So if we can jump to the next slide. So just to give you a quick rundown of the impacts of urban flooding. So the image on the left just is showing some of the infrastructure damage that you can expect from these types of floods. And just one more click. And also it's important to note the contamination of the floodwater that can come streaming through manhole covers. Now, New York operates a combined sewage and stormwater system. So this is where the heavy rain will actually mix with the sewer system. And when you see water coming up in these high rain events, that can be a combination of rainwater which has been running over the street. So it's not necessarily clean already, and then it can be mixed with sewage and then can be flooded out into the street. So it's really not very nice stuff. It can also contain hydrocarbons, oils, and other chemicals that come out of households and other plants, and people generally will walk through it. The New York spirit, you got to get to work, you walk through this pretty nasty liquid. And next slide. So also a key thing, and part of the reason why we got funding to investigate this, is for mobility restrictions that flooding can cause. Now you've got extreme events like the different hurricanes that have hit New York, but also just street flooding in general can impede traffic and can reduce mobility for city folk. Next slide. So how can we go about monitoring street level urban flooding? Next slide. So this is was one of the reasons for the Flood Sense project, and the challenge here was that we found that urban flooding was not really monitored or tracked, despite it happening quite often and the risks associated with it. So our goals, click, were to design, build, and deploy a low-cost and robust urban flood sensor. Click. I'm really sorry, I've got a bunch of images. So we built these and deployed them. This is the first one deployed over the Gowanus Canal, because Gowanus is one of our focus areas. Next slide. Next click. And we also deployed one over a street just close by the Gowanus Canal. And this is a common flooding point. You can see the sensor there, just with its little horn there, just pointing down on that street sign. Next slide. And we're also, our second goal is to develop and build an interface so we can communicate the data we collect from these flood events to a range of stakeholders, from community members all the way through to city agencies and also researchers. Next slide. This is where I've got all the information. So then the milestones so far is we formed what we're calling the FloodNet Consortium with researchers at CUNY, the Science and Resilience Initiative of Jamaica Bay, and we're also partnering with the Mayor's Office of Resiliency and the Mayor's Office of the CTO. We've been granted research funding from US DOT, who have an interest in street level flooding. That's through C2 Smart in Tandon, and the Empire State Development Fund have given us some funds to develop our online portal. We've developed our deployable flood sensor with pretty decent error. We've also been granted mounting permissions from DOT for street signposts. It's a really key thing to be able to deploy anything anywhere, and having DOT green light that has been fantastic. We've deployed 2 sensors in the Hamilton Beach area for coastal flooding and 2 in Gowanus to measure pluvial flooding, which is more street level stormwater flooding. We've collected 152 days of data with a bunch of measurements, and we've captured 2 street flooding events, which we were really happy about. Also, in terms of like the stakeholders and who is benefiting from this, we're working with the DEP on validation of their existing stormwater modeling, and early conversations with NOAA on validating their water level forecasting and also the calibration of their flood warning systems, and the Gowanus Canal Conservancy for community engagement. Next steps, deploy more sensors, develop new sensors with new modalities and deployment strategies, and actually implement this data portal for key stakeholders, probably by the end of 2021 or early 2022. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Next up is Dr. Henaff from NYU Tandon and CUSP.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I am going to talk about water also. And share my screen. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Cool, awesome. So what I wanted to talk about is actually one of the impacts of flooding that Charlie just mentioned. So looking specifically at the impact of flooding on the urban microbiome, so populations of microorganisms in the urban environment. This is a collaboration also with Andrea, Charlie, and Tiga, and so these 2 projects are very much interrelated. So as Charlie mentioned, there's a bunch of different contaminants in floodwater, and the contaminant that we were focusing on this particular project is sewage-related contaminants. So in New York City, we have a combined sewage system, meaning that stormwater and household wastewater go down in the same systems. And so when we have really strong weather events, like heavy rains, for example, that overwhelm the stormwater system, that means that the flood water that emerges from the flood drains or that stays stagnant in the street and that cannot drain fast enough contains raw sewage. And so the questions that we were trying to address with this study were, given that we know that there are sewage-related pathogens in the flood water, to what extent are they deposited on street surfaces? And also, how long do they stick around? How long does it take for this change in microbial population to persist after the floodwater has receded? And so the methodology that we're using for this is based on DNA sequencing. So we take samples with a swab from the sidewalk, we extract DNA from it, we sequence it to get a digital readout from that molecular information. We can also use those swabs to do culture experiments to actually grow bacteria and see what's alive. And then with the DNA sequencing data, we can ask the question of, what kind of species were present, how abundant were they, and if we have, multiple samples to compare, we can look at differences in these populations. So last year we presented this work. We were in kind of a pilot phase, and we were developing methodologies for each part of this process. How do you swab a sidewalk? How do you get repeatable measures? What kind of methodologies do you use? A lot of that methodology was worked out by two awesome high school students that Andrea had working in her lab a couple summers ago. And so they sorted out all of those details. And so with that in hand, with that kind of standard operating procedure in hand, we were ready and prepared to wait for the next big flood. And actually that waiting for the next big flood is what prompted the flood sensor development that Charlie just talked about. So we are basically one of the stakeholders in this flood sensor project. But our particular site of interest is the area around the Gowanus Canal. So the Gowanus Canal is both a floodplain and also a location where there are several combined sewage overflows. And there's particular areas in the Gowanus Canal watershed that flood very frequently. And so the site study that we established was on 9th Street, right towards the southern end of the canal. And we have identified two different locations. So our site location is a site that floods frequently, and our control location is just up the street a couple of blocks, and is a location that does not flood frequently. And so we had staked out these two locations as our sampling locations, and then just waited for it to flood. So before that, what we did is get like a baseline reading of what are the microbial populations in these two locations, so that then when we get information after flood, we know what we have to compare. So our control location is this one, our site location is this one, and we can see that already, we can see that as a baseline, the two microbial populations are different. What we don't know really is how that relates to the floodwater or not. And so we set up a sampling schedule in response to the great flood of summer 2020 that we collected a couple summers ago. And so the idea is that we wait for a flood to happen, sample the flood waters, and then wait for the flood water to recede, and then take swabs both in our sample site, so the site that has been flooded, for multiple days after the flood event. So at day 0, which is flood event, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and then less frequently up until 3 weeks after the flood event. And then also concurrently take samples from the control site at a slightly less frequent sampling rate, but so that we can compare how those changes over time happen. And so, long story short, what we saw with this particular data is that, so what we're looking at here is a 3-dimensional visualization of the microbial populations of these different locations over time. And so 2 dots that are near each other in this graph have similar microbial populations, and then dots that are far away from each other have different microbial populations. The dots here that are in kind of reddish brown colors are the control site, and then the dots that are here in kind of bluish colors are the sample site. So the baseline sample site, so before the flooding event, as you can see, looks pretty similar to the rest of the control dots. And then what happens after the flood, our sample site microbiome jumps all the way up here. And so that means that the microbiome 1 day after the flood is drastically different than it was before, and also drastically different from the control site. And then as the days progress, and that's these different blue colors, the microbiome slowly goes back towards its original state. So I'll have to say that we stopped sampling on day 11 here on this particular experiment because it flooded again. So it started our clock back up again. But what this gives us is an idea of the population dynamics of the urban microbiome in response to this drastic weather event such as flooding. And so what this allows us to tell us to do also is to start telling a story of the impact of things like climate change, for example, on the microbial environment that we live in. And so we can start teasing out kind of stories that we can tell with respect to the dynamics of these different populations. So for example, we can identify certain species that change in different ways in response to this event. So for example, there's a set of species that are introduced after the flooding and then continually decrease after the flooding event. There are also species that increase in concentration after the flooding event. So maybe the flooding created a particular condition in which those species are able to proliferate. Or there's some species that are eliminated by the flooding event. So that only exist in locations that are not flooded. And so,
sorry to interrupt, Elizabeth. I think we need to move to the next speaker in a moment.
Totally, that was it.
Cool.
So this is a very collaborative effort led by PhD student Wale and Andrea's lab, Chandrine Mabatasha, who's been doing the computational analyses, and then a bunch of people on this call.
Sweet, thanks, Elizabeth. Appreciate it. Yeah. And I think Kevin still hasn't been able to join us yet. So Rae Zimmerman is our next speaker, and she's coming from Wagner.
I just need my slides, right? Okay. And if you want to put it on slide share or something, right? Okay. Okay. What I'm reporting on today is actually 4 of the current projects that I'm involved in, but they all have one common theme, which is infrastructure interconnectivity, and basically talking about how one can enlarge public services if you use integrated frameworks in order to achieve risk reduction, equity, in particular for severe weather, climate change, and pandemics. My name is Rae Zimmerman. I'm currently a research professor emerita at NYU Wagner, and for many, many years, decades, was on the full-time faculty in public administration and urban planning at Wagner. And so I'm still here primarily doing research. Next slide, please. So the four projects that I'm currently going to describe are, one is an NSF, 3 are from NSF, funded by NSF, and 1 from the US DOT through the C2 Smart Center. So the one is a rapid grant where we're looking at how you could more effectively deploy resources to prevent panic buying during the pandemic. And my co-PI, my co-investigator, who's the PI, is Kuan-Yan Zhu, who's at NYU Tandon. I always seem to work with engineering firms. So here we're actually recording prices and goods in supermarkets and looking for shortages and price gouging. And I myself have actually been tracking the whole food system and the transportation systems, how they've changed in the pandemic. The second one is with Deborah Lafer, who will be in the next session. She's the PI, I'm the co-PI, and we have two co-leaders that are members of the Gizmo, which is a GIS organization, Wendy Dorf and Al Leidner. And here we're looking at a very heavily research stakeholder initiated project on underground infrastructure and how we can obtain data, close data gaps, and integrate data for resiliency against extreme events using 3D visualization and synthesis of subsurface data. Currently, our two study areas are Midtown Manhattan, including Grand Central, and Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And our stakeholders are business improvement districts, a number of key community organizations, and definitely the utilities and government agencies, primarily local. The third is with Professor Joseph Chow, who's the PI. It's through C2 Smart. I'm the co-PI, and it's on urban microtransit and how we can improve transit time and cost and waiting time and the like, improve urban mobility through the use of microtransit, in particular vans, and VIA, well-known private company, is one of our partners. And so the scope is, again, New York City. However, we have over a half a dozen US cities for comparison. And finally, there's a 5-year project, total of 12 million, run through Arizona State University, the Urban Resilience to Extreme Weather Events related events, and it's a sustainability research network, again focusing on infrastructure, but it's got a unique integration of social, ecological, and technological systems. And here we're using 9 cities, mostly in the US, but a couple of them in Latin America as well. If you may I have the next slide. Now, here is a very quick overview of just 3 of them because I couldn't get to everything. And you see at the top, though, that the key element is how energy, transport, water, and occasionally telecom are all integrated. On the upper right is the RAPID project, and the dotted line below is how we used to do things. Manufacturing, production went to wholesaling, went to retailing, and then to consumers. But during the pandemic, big shortcut. Manufacturing is selling directly to consumers. Impacted products, you know, I've written a lot on this. Flour bags are resized from huge things to down to consumer sizes. Food and beverage cartons, wonderful paper given at the Transportation Research Board about how they're adapting those to consumers. Steel cans and the like, and the blue, again, is the new direction. The UREX project, this is lower right, is one of my pieces of work on green infrastructure, heavily dependent on transportation, water, and energy. Too much to go through now. There are papers written, and essentially you have to modify transportation in order to retard water and manage water, and that saves energy as well. And then the third project going on with Professor Lafer and Wendy Dorf and Al Leidner is using MUDDY, which is an open geospatial model for underground data definition. And there we have multiple stakeholders, and we interact with them, many of them each week. And we're using, you know, the building footprints, roadways, geology. Then we have network characteristics over on the right, their various attributes, special features which are associated with non-utilities, and then at the top, the utility networks. And this is a very fast project, 4 months, and hopefully it will position us for a $1 million add-on, which we applied for in May. And then one thing I didn't show was the micro transit project with C2 Smart, and there we're working heavily with a lot of interactions, a huge number of interactions for time, cost, and the like. And again, the common theme is infrastructure interactions, and this actually follows on 2 other research grants I did with Professor Kwanyang Zhu, NSF funded CRISP and RIPS. And so we keep moving ahead using the same framework to work on different, very different projects. And I acknowledge all the funding for that. And I really strictly tried to keep to the 3 slides here. I think that's it. Oh, the next slide very quickly gives you some of the progress. The Rapid grant, I did presentations last November and in February to various professional conferences. The Civic project, moving ahead with dozens of meetings with stakeholders. Urban microtransit, similarly extensive multimodal models in 6 cities with VIA input, looking at time of travel and cost. And the UREX, I gave the URL, which I can give to anybody. That's been going on for 5 years, and there are dozens upon dozens of publications. And I list only the ones this year and the end of last year that I had been involved with in urban climate, climatic change, and sustainable cities and society, and a whole bunch of others. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. That was excellent. Appreciate you sharing that with us. Our next speaker is Tae Hong Park, who is coming from Steinhardt.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen.
Great.
And
And there's a little bit of feedback.
on my side?
Yeah, like it's a little bit of fuzz. I don't know if you guys are hearing that as well. Not feedback, I should say, but
Oh, must be the not sure actually. That's a problem because we're dealing with noise and I'm creating noise. So apologies for that.
it's not bad though. So if we need to go forward, it's okay.
Sorry, I think it's my computer next, which crashed like 5 minutes ago. In any case, it's great to see everyone. My name is Tae Hong Park, and I'm coming from the Steinhardt Music Department, and it's called MPAT, Department of Music and Performing Arts Professions. That's a hard one. And I'm going to talk about sound mapping cities in 3D and this sort of 3-pronged, 3-dimensional approach. We're looking at a data-driven approach, community-driven approach, and art-driven approach. And the big question is always, why do something like this? As we probably are cognizant of the population increase worldwide and megacities becoming, or cities becoming megacities like New York City, San Francisco, Seoul, Tokyo, there's a big rise in population. And with the big rise in populations, what we have also seen is more and more machines sort of servicing and helping us keep afloat as a sort of organization in a sense. It's a global phenomena that is noises affecting residents and families, leading to cardiovascular complications, productivity, children's learning, sleep deprivation, property devaluation, and so on. So I think it's actually maybe easy to understand how something like noise can really impact you or as a person. And I remember when I first got to New York in 2012, I would always wake up when the garbage trucks came in the mornings. And after a year, I would not do that anymore. And I'm like, the garbage trucks disappear? Thank goodness not. They remain, but my ears adapted. And that's the sort of problem that exists where you get used to the energy that comes into your system, yet it still comes into your system. It's kind of like being woken up at like 11 p.m. or 2 a.m. in the morning, and then sort of anticipating what will happen to you the next day, which can be pretty crappy, as they say. So if that prolongs over a day, a week, a month, a year, 2 years, 3 years, you can sort of see the cumulative effect and how that can impact all these aspects. So what we're trying to sort of find out is when this happens, where it happens, and then why it happens, and then how it happens. And this is how the Citigram project came to be in around 2011. So actually it's been 10 years, which is actually pretty crazy. Didn't actually realize I was getting that old, but also last year we had COVID, which sort of made time vertical. So here we are. And as to the 3 dimensions that I mentioned, 3 modules, we sort of follow this adage or saying, you can't fix what you can't measure. So data is very important. And from that perspective, we developed basically a smart sensor network, specifically that works for sound and noise mapping and sound mapping in real time. And smart because it is using AI, because there's a lot of data. We want to compress the data from high bandwidth to low value to low bandwidth and high value. And that's where AI comes in and signal processing. Here's a picture of or graph of this axis is basically days, this axis is 24 hours, and this axis, the vertical, is the dBA levels, and the colors are acoustic events or noise events that happen throughout the day. And you can see sort of from midnight till 6 a.m. nothing much happens, and then, as they say, all hell breaks loose. New York City is a city that never sleeps, and there's many cities like New York that never sleeps, and probably New Yorkers are very well known in that respect. So that's where we get the data, and data-driven is so important because we both need both quantitative and qualitative data. And the next part is the community-driven aspect. Why community-driven? I'm sort of approaching this as a of, by, for the people type research, and I'm not even calling it research. I'm calling it a project. And it's I think important in 2 ways: that you have participation by the people who actually are subject to these situations. I mean, also for sensor network scaling. So there's always ways to get grants and from the government or institutions and scale that way. And I thought that was not the best way to do it. But if people have incentives to do it, and if we can sort of create a technology that enables people to participate, then wouldn't that be really scalable? That's what we are pushing forward. And here's, I don't have a picture right now, but what I call a window sensor. So this idea is that how can you get people to participate? It has to be easy to use, right? And the question then is, well, do you have a window at home? And the answer probably should be yes. And so I created a window sensor, like a sticker sensor that can stick to the window, and that becomes your microphone or your AI sensor. And then the next question is, do you need like a special device? And the answer is yes and no. The question is, do you have a web browser? And if the answer is yes, then you can participate. So 2 questions. Do you have a window at home? Yes. Do you have a web browser at home? Yes. Do you have internet so that you can actually analyze the data and whatnot? So those are the questions that make community-driven approaches possible, and in turn make scaling possible. Sort of like a YouTube situation for noise sensing, or for just environmental data, environmental sensing. The last one is the more fun part, where it's the art-driven dimension. And I sort of follow this idea that music is the language of humankind and bring awareness. And like the thing in my background that you saw was actually a data-driven installation work that would be reacted to noise data from all around the world in an installation space. And people come and they ask questions. And usually people ask me about what's your background. Then I have to explain or I explain as to what that is, and that brings awareness to the people. So these three dimensions that play a part in the City Grant project, some of the progress that we've made over the past 10 years. So we sort of shifted from this idea as a research project for the sake of research and sort of beyond the ivory tower and bringing it to the public. And I think sort of a pathway towards that goal was partnering with industry. So that's what's happening now with startups in partnership with community organizations, because a lot of the research and technical stuff is actually not that complicated. I think it's really ideas, but it becomes a socio-technical issue because you have people involved, and I want to have people involved. So we're sort of trying to solve that, or come up with a good socio-technical solution to a problem that's a socio-technological conundrum. Pilot programs we've done around the US, Canada, and Germany, and we want to bridge the gap between the hypotheses that we have and what the realities are on site and with when we interact with people. Is the project currently on schedule or off schedule or delayed? I would say it's sort of divided into three segments. I think the first 30% was pretty difficult to achieve, the beginnings. The next 50% was pretty fast, and you get sort of going and you're like at 80. And then the next 10% became like a bottleneck, and you had to solve the devil is in the details type situation. Next 5%, and I would say we're at the last 3 plus 2% of the project, where we'll be quite happy with where we are and where we can take this project in the future. Many publications and events and workshops, like I think 2 years ago we did the International Noise Awareness Day, and we did like a performance at the Carnegie Hall, just with data and that being streamed into Carnegie Hall and jamming with Planet Earth, as it were. Forthcoming book by Springer Verlag, another book chapter on this topic, and doing a presentation at the Acoustical Society of America this summer. And that's basically it.
Awesome, thank you for that. So in the interest of time, what I thought we could do is we're supposed to have a brief panel discussion and then question and answers from the group, but given that we can do some questions and answers in the breakout session, I thought I have just one question for the panel. And this actually came from Kevin Cromar, who couldn't join us, so at least he's joining us in spirit. And I thought I could pose that to the panelists and then see if there's questions, and then at in 5 minutes, we'll go to the breakout. But a lot of these talks have this applications to actual planning and management and interventions in cities. And so a question that Kevin posed that I thought was really thoughtful was, what are some thoughts on how we can bridge from the research that we're doing to actual application and implementation by city agencies or other stakeholders that might benefit from the type of work that we're doing. And I don't know if any of the panelists want to kick this off, Dr. Zimmerman or.
Yeah, I think nowadays there's so much emphasis on stakeholder interaction in all the research. And I think we're hoping that we can influence in my projects the way they look at their own infrastructure and talk to other managers and operators of infrastructure, and also people in the neighborhood, and try to get that interaction and process going. And we've gone pretty far in that, in getting them to certainly recognize and respect the need for that, and also the need for data and in this problem space. And so it's going to take a long time. It's going to take commitment on the part of the stakeholders as well. And then, you can't go everywhere. And the stakeholders you do interact with, you hope are representative in some way. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Charlie, do you want to see your hand up?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Rae. But there's help from the NSF side. So they have a grant called the Transfer to Practice, which is like an add-on for existing NSF grants, and you can if you're successful with getting this TTP grant, then it's money just to take what you've built, and in our case, sensor networks, and like have it applied by your key stakeholders. And that's been really helpful for us because we're really not equipped to build out longitudinal systems that are going to be used for years beyond the end of a funding project. Yeah, but this TTP has really helped, and you're totally right. Having the right people in the agencies to help carry and translate what you've done in a research setting to something more longitudinal is like really key.
Yeah. And I want to add to that also this question about who's driving the research, which kind of slightly came up in both of your comments, and in the fact that, you know, sometimes we do research and then we bring it to our city agency partners if we're lucky enough to have those partners already, right? And other times they come to us. And the more experience that I'm having working with city agencies in a couple different realms, I realize how important it is to have the research driven or kind of requested by our partners. Otherwise, you kind of bring something to them that they never necessarily, and it doesn't mean that it won't ever work. And I, from the Flood Sense project, we were actually approached by city agencies about the need for sensor data for hyperlocal frequent flooding. And with that engagement, we actually meet with our city agency partners every single week, and they are almost pushing the project more than we are, which is kind of exciting. On the COVID work that I do, I kind of have both examples where, the DEP came to us and said, we need to do this work, which was great. But the DOH never asked for it. So the Department of Health never asked for this data. And it's actually that translation is a major challenge right now. And so you kind of have both sides on. So, I would say stakeholder engagement, incredibly important early on and making sure that they're actually key partners in developing the project.
Yeah, I think we can say that for agency stakeholders, but also for community stakeholders too. I think that there's also sometimes this kind of presumption coming from academia or engineering where like, oh yeah, we invented this thing that's gonna fix this thing for you. And then maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. And so I think just as consulting with city agencies is really important from the get-go. Having actual engagement and kind of participatory design from community stakeholders is also really key for anything actually to be used in the long term and have a longevity beyond just what our funding cycles do.
Yeah, I think I want to echo what Elizabeth was saying, and that's basically our route, sort of going grassroots and talking to the communities that are affected, and it's in their backyard. And that's sort of driving our research. And similar to what's happening on your side, Andrea, they push us more than we push ourselves. And and the sort of positive story is that we're not funded by anyone, so they know that we do it for them or for us, right, as a community. And I'm part of that community, so that seems to have worked. And sort of that's why I was mentioning this is a socio-technological problem where that gap needs to sort of be minimized so we can push it forward and have it sustainable.
Awesome, thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, my research is on city-owned utilities as a means for energy transition, and specifically Vancouver's district energy market. First of all, very quickly, I'm going to go through this quite quickly, and then we can do the Q&A. But district energy systems, basically, I didn't know anything about them before this research, but district energy systems group together the heating and cooling of buildings. So instead of each building having their own, there's a central heater or cooler, and that makes it more efficient. And these have been around for literally more than a century. They're quite common in Europe and in Asia. And in fact, there's actually more than 7,000 in North America. But they've regained popularity because they're a relatively easy way to switch a lot of buildings towards renewable energy. And one of those cases is Metro Vancouver, where there were 6 systems up to the early 2000s, but they had stagnated for almost 4 decades. And then since the early 2000s, they have really picked up. Heating and cooling is about 50% of the energy consumption in buildings, and in Vancouver, it's the largest source of greenhouse emissions. And so the transition to district energy systems and energy efficiency measures could reduce emissions up to 58% for buildings. So it is an increasingly important dimension in reducing emissions. I came to this with a lot of interest. The more specific research questions are why are city-owned utilities proliferating in Vancouver? If they have actually helped accelerate the energy transition, or if they have hampered it, and what motivates city entrepreneurship? Why here? Why now? More broadly, I'm interested in how the energy transition, looking at the other side of the coin, how the energy transition is actually changing cities' governance structures and institutions, how cities need to adapt to actually achieve the energy transition, how ownership is comparing to regulating as a tool to achieve certain policy objectives, which is a very old dilemma in public administration, and if city ownership is actually a viable tool to advance economic, environmental, and industrial policy concerns, given that it's kind of reviving, right? I might skip the literary motivation, but basically we don't really know how the energy transition needs to happen, and cities are key player, and they've been understudied. And there's this recent drive to municipalize or remunicipalize utilities and other services, and this intersects both of them pretty well. I'm going to skip the first part. The methods are so far semi-structured interviews with key players that have been kind of snowballing. I've covered 3 of the main municipalities: private operators, real estate developers, provincial utility. I need to talk to the provincial regulator, so trying to take care of all the stakeholders. And this to me is kind of it kind of sums it up. You see a quite stable number of non-commercial systems. And then right before 2004, there were no city-owned district energy systems, and then they've actually skyrocketed. Well, they've grown and they've outpaced private systems. So, why is this? If there's so many problems to public ownership of anything, then why are these cities deciding to go open a new business line and deliver heat and cooling to buildings? And from what I gather, it's obviously it's a bunch of different things. There was a provincial mandate to reduce emissions, but they kind of threw it towards the municipalities to implement, so they scrambled to find solutions, and district energy systems just happen to make sense, and they're catching up. There is an element of the provincial price on carbon that some private sector parties have said that it's incentivized them to enter the market, but mostly it seems it's entrepreneurial administrations in these municipalities. Vancouver decided to really cut emissions, partly because they were hosting the 2010 Olympics with that green flag, and they changed bylaws. They decided to keep their own utility in something that I find quite a good twist. They actually decided to do a city-owned utility, in part because city utilities are not regulated by the Utilities Commission. So it's this, I think, interesting issue of a city government taking advantage of a regulatory loophole to then try to get their way. And now the Utilities Commission is actually inquiring whether they should regulate these municipal utilities, because they've grown so much and they've made so many different types of partnerships. So that's an interesting angle. Basically everyone that I talked to agrees that city ownership accelerated the transition, but now a lot of people see potential setbacks or the city hindering private sector regulation. Now you hear people say, well, if they just let us do it our way, we would reduce emissions faster, we would make our buildings greener, but they force us into a certain type of regulation, a certain type of system. And technology has changed so much that we can actually do things better now. And in terms of the public administration angle of it, the most interesting thing to me is how many potential conflicts of interest have appeared once that cities decide to become to own and also to regulate their own district energy. Suddenly you have the planning agency and the city utility both trying to reduce emissions, but if the city agency pushes for more efficient energy buildings, that reduces the demand of the district utility, and they don't like that. And so they need to figure that out. And you know, the city tried to do it to give a resemblance of regulation by having the city hall regulate the rates, but then, you know, people complain about the rates, and so city hall withheld a rate increase, and that actually makes sense politically, but it jeopardizes the financial viability of this of the district energy. So some of the issues that have been raised in the literature for decades about politicization of rates, or, you know, government should not be involved in these directly because things get politicized and derailed, are actually happening. So it's, you know, that's where it is now. I have a lot of literature to review and to see how some of the state-owned enterprises of the past kind of grew and then mostly crashed, and see what's happened, what's different now, if anything, and see if they're getting it right or if we're committing the same mistakes. But that's basically where I am, and I'll be happy to hear any suggestions, comments, or questions.
Thank you, Daniel. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts?
And if not, I can leave you to go take a glass of water. That can also happen.
That's awesome. Wait, Daniel, can you remind me what is your background in terms of like what school are you in? What program?
I'm a student at Wagner, so my PhD is in public administration.
Cool.
Before Wagner, I worked. I've been working in government in Mexico, in mostly very large state-owned enterprises. One is the Mexican oil company, the Mexican government-owned oil company, which was horrible and interesting at the same time.
Cool.
And for a longer period of time before that, in the Mexican Social Security Institute, which is a healthcare provider. It's more similar to the Canadian healthcare system than the US healthcare system. It's like the VA, but for any person with a formal job. And there was a lot of work on internal reform that I was involved in, and so issues of improving bureaucracy and improving public administration and reforming it are part of what drives my interest. So the energy transition is interesting and necessary, I believe, but it's more of an excuse to actually study these issues of entrepreneurial cities and public-private boundaries, and how we are, you know, just perennially redefining those.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean,
I did a master's in sorry?
Saying I have a siren in the back. I'm sorry. I was going to ask, yeah, about sort of that feedback between that experience and if there's sort of findings from this work, as you mentioned, could be applied to other things, and what you see some of those applications and connections.
And one of the main ones, which is definitely also in the literature, is, you know, from the outside, people talk about the government as if it were a monolith, and even just agencies as if they were a monolith. And all these different agencies have so many different bosses and bottom lines that they need to respond to. And many of these are in conflict, and many of them, even as I mentioned, they align in theory, but then in practice they run into each other all the time. And so all the formal and informal ways in which a city agency or a city hall, like a city administration, manages to go through that conflict and actually, push policy through, is I think it's very difficult to research. It's, there's no, basically it's impossible to do in quantitative analysis. Obviously, counterfactuals are impossible. Things change all the time. No two contexts or agencies are the same. So that's really hard. But the types of conflicts are, I think, very similar. And so, even here, the problems that you see at the city level, you see them replicated at the provincial level. And at the provincial level, you have a provincial utility and a provincial regulator, and you see the provincial government trying to push energy policy through its utility because it can't really do it through its regulator, because the regulator has to go through Congress and the utilities just, the executive branch. The same thing happening at the local level. There's so many interactions. I think it's really, really interesting. And to, was it Steve, I think, that posed the question of how to link this to practice, that you, Andrea, that you read. In any case, whoever it was, how to link our research with practice, I'm driven mostly by practice more than by theory, to be honest. And I think it's very important for cities to get ownership right and to get district energy systems right, because there's a lot of risk of having infrastructure for 20, 30 years that may or may not be useful, or that may actually slow down the energy transition. Maybe there's different ways of achieving policy goals. One is you own your district energy system. One is you regulate the private sector. Another one is, there's all these different ones, and it varies so much in context. But we need to find ways of understanding those nuances and actually having those play out where decision makers are working. So we'll see how that goes.
Thank you. Good luck. Good luck with this work. I think we've reached the time limit for this session, and I wanted to thank everyone, all of the speakers for coming. For those of you who are still here in the main room, everyone who joined us